Well, guys, I hope you have a Bible, and if you do, would you make your way to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 this morning? 2 Corinthians chapter 4, that's where we're going to be. In your bulletin, it says 1 Corinthians, and sorry about that. I don't know, it's just like, sometimes I don't know if you ever do that. For me, it's like 1 and 2 Corinthians, 1 and 2 Timothy. Sometimes like, you just say it, and then it's like, well, I meant the other one. It's like that's what it is, and so it's my fault, but hopefully you got it now so you can make your way with us to 2 Corinthians 4 for a special message this morning. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles around you and chairs in front of you, page number on the screen. If you want to use an electronic device, you can do that. We'd love to have you follow along in the Word of God. We want to give the same invitation to you guys who are in the overflow and those who are online, just inviting you to have a Bible and open it up this morning so that as we cover this section, God would speak to you through it. It is certainly our great desire. So Bible's open. Let's do what we do regularly. Let's take a quick moment and pray. I'm leading, but I'm hoping you're praying as well. And let's ask God to make it personal. Let's ask Him to open up His truth to each one of us now. Would you join me in prayer? God, I do ask right now, we have this opportunity to dive into your word together, and your word is powerful. It is truth. God, we need to hear it. We need to see it. Jesus, I think about your promise that you would give us the Holy Spirit to be our helper. I believe that that's exactly what you continue to faithfully do. So I'm asking for that help right now. I'm asking that you would give us ears to hear what your Spirit is speaking. And that together, though we study this section together, and though I'm asking that you would give us an overall understanding of it, I am asking, Lord, that you would speak to us personally. Even just one thing, one nugget, one verse that just is louder than all the rest to each one of us. Something that would be you speaking to us. God, do that in us. Do it in each of us. Give us ears to hear what you're saying. I pray right now in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. I want to give you an invitation to one of the most joyful celebrations that you would ever and will ever be a part of. I want to tell you there's something that you're invited to into a place of celebration, into a place that is great joy. Now, the anticipation of that is found in a holiday that's on the calendar this week. Yet Tuesday is the beginning of what's known as the Feast of Tabernacles, a celebration, a holiday that God has prescribed in the Old Testament for the nation of Israel, begins on Tuesday, and today I want to call you to see what it is and what it anticipates. Well, before we dive into that specifically, let's back up just a little bit and remind you that Tuesday, the Feast of Tabernacles, finds itself as one of three what we call fall feasts of Israel. 3 feasts that take place in the fall months, usually in September or October. We've spent the last couple of studies talking about them, looking at what they were. 2 weeks ago, you got to celebrate Rosh Hashanah. That really was the Feast of Trumpets on September 7th. Last week, September 16th on Thursday, was the Day of Atonement. And then again, this coming Tuesday is the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as Sukkot. So you might see it that way on the calendar. Sukkot literally means tabernacle or tent. And so that's, again, what it's picturing. That's what it is. Well, again, all that's important. Again, it was prescribed in the Old Testament. But the great reality behind these is it pictures for you a foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to do. We looked back at the Feast of Trumpets, and if you were with us then, we talked about that being a foreshadowing of the rapture, a time where Jesus comes back to gather us together in the clouds. It's going to be a good day. And then we talked about last week that the Feast of Atonement, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, is a picture of the second coming of Christ, where Jesus comes to rule and reign as King of Kings, and then taking us into that final judgment. And then today, as we anticipate what's happening on Tuesday, we get a picture of seeing just what this place that with Jesus is taking us into eternity future, into this picture of what heaven is and all that's going to be there, and an anticipation that you and I are invited into. So again, that's just powerful. So we're looking at these three feasts that are taking place here, and all three of these picture things that are yet future. Well, before we can dive into that, we need to back it up one more step. And we've done this the last couple of weeks, and most of you are pretty familiar with it. These three feasts find themselves as a part of 7. In the Old Testament, God prescribes 7 annual feasts. 7 feasts that are meant to be celebrated by the people of God, by Israel specifically, every single year. Now, they're powerful realities, but one more time for us, the reality is they aren't just for us to see as celebrations, but pictures of Christ, because each one of them is. We think about just the first 3, Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of First Fruits. Those really celebrated the first coming of Christ. He dies on the cross, becomes our Passover. He's buried, and he rises again at the Feast of First Fruits. It's incredible joy that celebrates that. Fast forward 50 days, you get to Pentecost, sometimes it's called the Feast of Weeks, that is a picture of what Jesus is doing now. That he's in the process of just drawing people to him from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And it's a great reality that that's the space of history where you live in right now. But we're gazing forward to those days when Jesus comes back. The fall feast picturing, again, Jesus' second coming and all that's in light of that. It's a pretty cool picture. But one more time, it's a picture that God gives us in the Word of God. It's a picture that God describes for us. In fact, you know what? We haven't done this so far as we've done it. Let's do it very quickly. Keep your finger or bulletin there in 2 Corinthians, and would you open up to the book of Leviticus? Go to the book of Leviticus. It's the 3rd book of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. So go back to the beginning. Make your way to Leviticus chapter 23. Thought it might just be helpful for you to see that, I'm not just putting these together. God is. He's the one that describes all 7 of these feasts, and Leviticus 23 describes all 7. Now, we're not going to read the whole chapter. I don't know if your Bible has it kind of broken up into each individual feast. I'll give you a quick rundown of it that might be helpful or might not, but you might want to go back and read all of it later. But let's just notice at the beginning of it. Verse 1 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocation, these are my feasts." And it's just good again to say, hey, these are God's. These are what he's sharing with his people. These are a picture of what he's going to do and what he is. And so if you read through it, you get down in verses 4 and 5 that really unpack for us the beginning of the whole thing, just the Passover lamb, as it tells us in verse 5. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. Then in the next verses, running from 6 to 8, you have really that picture of unleavened bread and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that would take us then into the Feast of First Fruits that really runs from verse 9 down to verse 14, which is again a picture of Jesus being our first fruits or the rapture. Incredible realities that flow out of that. Then from verse 15 all the way down to verse 22, you have what's called the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost or the Feast of 50 Days that would be a part of it, that one more time is a picture of where we are now. But then down in verse 23, you get to the fall feast, which is again where we've been. In verse 23, you get the Feast of Trumpets, that is a picture of the whole thing. Then in verse 26 to 32, you have the Day of Atonement, where we were last week, where he says, okay, this is what it is. In verse 27, on the 10th day of the 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. And again, a great celebration. Then from verse 33 to 44 is the Feast of Tabernacles. That's where we get to go this morning. That's what we're going to talk about. But again, it's just helpful for you to see. Here's a whole chapter that lays all of that out. And he says, these are my feasts. These are what I'm prescribing every single year. Well, again, we're looking at the Feast of Tabernacles. I won't read that whole section. If you want to read it more later, you can. But let's just read a couple verses. Verse 33. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. Pause there and again just begin to understand. he begins to lay out this Feast of Tabernacles, this one that is this incredible celebration. And there's a few things that I want you to understand about it. There's a few things that are found here, more than we'll dive into entirely, but at least a few that I want to quickly just draw your attention to. The Feast of Tabernacles. It is the last and longest and most joyful feast of any of the seven. The Feast of Tabernacles, it's the last. Yeah, that's what it is. It's the end of the chapter. It's the final feast. It's the one that pictures the very kind of the last section of it, and it does so both in time for us and in this reality. It's also the longest. It takes place for 7 days. It's not just beginning and end. Every day was meant to be a part of that celebration. So it's a week-long celebration that'll start this coming Tuesday, and again, for Jews that celebrate it, it will last them a week. But it is joyful. It is meant to be joyful. Now again, I don't have time to dive back into it, but not all the feasts were that. Some of the feasts were humbling feasts. Some of the feasts were meant to humble yourself before God. Even Yom Kippur was a part of that. Some of them were feasts of thanksgiving, and some of them were feasts of again, dealing with sin and all of that. But this one, by its mark, here in the chapter and in the other places it's spoken of in the Old Testament, is a time to entirely rejoice. Go down and see it. It says it this way in verse 40. It says, "And you shall take for yourselves on the first day fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days." Wow. Okay, again, I just wanted you to see it. He says, I want you to rejoice. I want you to have great joy in God's presence for 7 days. It was meant to be that kind of celebration. And again, I think that's a powerful reality for us. In that celebration, part of it was to remember what God had done for them. Keep reading. He says it this way in verse 42, "And you shall dwell in booths," the ones that they just talked about building, all the branches that he just said you're going to gather. You're going to dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses declared to the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. So this feast, its pattern, its way of kind of celebrating it was a very specific celebration. It was a celebration that God says, I want you to remember what I did. Now, if you have a good understanding of your Old Testament, this will be really good. If you have a loose understanding, I apologize, but quickly giving it to you, God rescued the children of Israel out of Egypt. He did so through the Passover lamb that really was a picture of Jesus dying on the cross. They come out of Egypt, they go through the parting of the Red Sea when Moses parts the Red Sea, and they begin this journey that takes them from Egypt to the Promised Land. But it's a 40-year journey. It's a 40-year wandering for them. It's a 40-year space where coming out of Egypt, they live for 40 years having no homeland. Having no space to call their own, they move throughout the whole thing. They live in tents. They live in these portable kind of dwellings that are a part of their whole space. They do that for 40 years till they finally make their way into the land. And when they get into the land and they have a land that is their own and they have homes and they have that celebration, he then says, I want you to do this feast where you remember those years, where you remember the years where tents were what you lived in, where you had tents as your dwelling, which is what tabernacles means again. Tabernacle literally means tent, or in our text, in the New King James, it even calls it a booth. So that's what they do. So the design of this feast was to remember that. So they literally would go and build booths. And that's kind of this little graphic I have for you, just this idea of building a little tent or a booth. Now, most Jews today who will celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, again, starting on Tuesday, they don't actually do it. I mean, very few actually will live in a tent for the next week. I mean, they just don't, just like, no. So most Jews will simply build one, and they put a table in it, and they have their meals in it. And so for the next week, they just have all their meals kind of in an outside little dwelling place, and people will build them. All over Israel, they'll be building them this next week. People who are celebrating in the midst of it, they find themselves in so many different kinds of designs. Some of them kind of tent-like structures, some of them made out of wood, some of them literally made out of branches. I mean, the designs will be many, but the point of it, again, is to commemorate those years. And it's a good picture, by the way. Some of you know Aaron and Angela. They do a really good job both of kind of walking through this, teaching them. Some of you know they're on vacation, and so that's what they did. They're up in the mountains right now, and so they built one. So they sent us a picture or sent Gene a picture, and you can't really, but they kind of got the whole little lean-to thing happening there. It's their Feast of Tabernacles. This is a great little thing to do, in the midst of it. And I just tell you, hey, that's kind of the point, is it is this picture of having this remembering of what that's like. Now, it's not hard. In fact, this is just a very simple message this morning, and you may fully just understand where we're going, but I want you to think it through piece by piece. Because there's a piece of this that he's inviting you and I to understand and to think about what tabernacles looks like. So if you're still there in Leviticus, now leave that. Go back with me to where I had you originally open up. Go with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, as we want to think about this idea of the Feast of Tabernacles and what this is and what it celebrates for us. Hopefully you made a mark there, so you're already there. Quick FYI, by the way, we also want to make some references into the book of Revelation, though we're not going to dive deeply there. If you were with us last week, we did the Day of Atonement, and we talked about Revelations 19 and 20 that really picture that day. But then in chapters 21 and 22, it really is a picture of this. Everything that happens in those two chapters are what the Feast of Tabernacles celebrates. So if you're doing the Bible reading with us, you guys know we have the Bible reading bookmarks. Hopefully you're just kind of tracking along for those who do it. If you do that, when you come to the reading, that's what we'll have you read. We'll have you read Revelation 21 and 22, and I'm just inviting you to go deeper than we're going to go this morning, covering more that's there. But understand it again, that's the reality, that he's drawing you and I to an understanding of what's going to take place in that day. So to see that, we begin with this understanding of tents. Because it really is a comparison here between tents and a home. The tent, while it's not a hard concept, it's a picture of our bodies now. The tent, when the Bible uses that as an illustration, he uses it as a picture of our physical bodies. Go there and see. Talks about it in verse 16. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. Fast forward down to verse 1 of chapter 5. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed. Pause there. So there is this reality that he's inviting you and I to gaze and to think about the body that you're living in right now and to see that as a tent. And if you can do that, then he told us there in verse 16 that this tent, our outward man, is perishing. Now I hope this isn't like shocking news to you, but honestly, sometimes it is. You're perishing, every single one of you. I mean, I don't know if I could communicate that to you as seriously as I'd want to. Imagine going to the doctor. Maybe you had some tests run, and you show up at the doctor, and you're waiting for the test to run, but he has this somber expression, like, I have to tell you some news. And so if you're maybe like me, you'd be like, just give it to me. Like, just give it to me straight. Don't sugarcoat it. Tell me what you see. And the doctor looks at you and says, I need to tell you. You're dying. You're dying. I don't know what that would mean for you. I don't know if you heard that. Be like, what? I'm dying? I mean, I had no idea. Can I just tell you, every one of you here right now, you're dying. You're perishing. There's not anybody in this room that that's not true of. I mean, I hope that's not like news to you. Like, I really thought, if I just ate well enough and had that good diet that I could just somehow like live forever. I mean, what am I doing this exercise thing for then? No, you are dying. I mean, there's not anybody here that you're not on a road right now that given time, it might happen today or in a year or 5 years or 10 years or 50 years. One way or another, you're going to die. There's not anybody that this is not the road you're on. Your physical body is perishing. So he says that's what we are. He says, here's this thing. Even though we don't lose heart, he says in verse 16, even though our outward man is perishing, yet our inward man is being renewed day by day. Verse 17, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So not only are we perishing, we are facing affliction, difficulties, problems. Hey, this isn't like something that the Bible didn't tell us. In fact, Jesus was really clear about it. He looked at his disciples, he said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. That's what's coming. Like, you're going to be in a world and it's going to be hard. Be of good cheer, he says, I've overcome the world, but it's not a surprise. In this world, we face difficulty. That said, he defines it as he says it's a light affliction, which is just a moment, or it's a light momentary affliction. That's good news. That's good news right now. And again, one of those things that is just true for all of us. That there's not any of us that's not a part of it. Now, if you feel like that what you're going through isn't a light affliction, I'm going to say, in the scheme of eternity it is. Paul can say this. And I hope it's clear, but I personally think Paul probably had a harder road than anybody in this room is having. If you want to go and read it later, go back and read 2 Corinthians 12 when he'll talk about it. And he'll talk about how he'd been beaten 5 times with rods. He'd been stoned and left for dead. He'd spent a day and the night in the deep, in the middle of the ocean, just kind of floating. He's like, I have faced so much in this world. And Paul says, actually, it's just a little thing. In the scheme of things, it's a light affliction, and it's just for a moment. But can I tell you something? It's more than that. Go back and read it again. Verse 17, for our light affliction, which is just for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Boy, we could spend a bunch of time on this, but can I just tell it to you in the most simple way? It's working for you. There's not anybody in this room that right now that what you're going through is wasted. There's not anybody that God would look at and say, hey, whatever you're going through right now, it actually means nothing. It actually is going nowhere. That's probably one of our biggest fears, but I can say that with 100% confidence because God says so. He's working all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose, and all means all. And he just looks at what you're facing right now and just tells you it's not pointless, it's not meaningless, it has value, it's working things, and just to believe that it's doing something even into eternity would do great measure for our soul. Boy, we could spend more time on that, but it would kind of get us lost from where we're supposed to be this morning, so we come back to it. So we're perishing. In this world we have affliction, and this place is temporary. That's what he says there in verse 18. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen, they're just temporary. But the things which are not seen, those are the eternal things. Those are the things that last. I mean, these things, they're just temporary. They're just passing. So one more time in chapter 5, verse 1, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed. So this tent, our physical bodies, that's what's happening. They're going to be destroyed. And 100%, I just want to tell you, that's true. Now you might be sitting there and saying, well, Jim, I thought this was supposed to be joyful. I mean, I thought we were supposed to be excited about this. This isn't really exciting, but you need to see it. Before we can talk about what's good, there's a sense of being reminded for where you are. And I just want to tell you, there's nobody in this room that this isn't true for, but some of you just needed to know that you're not alone. Right now, you're in a body that's dying, and you're facing affliction. There are things that this world are set against you, but it's a passing thing. It's a temporary thing, but it's all going to be destroyed. All that we see and all that it is, it's kind of like a tent. These physical bodies and what we're facing, it's just a temporary dwelling. While we're here, it's not the eternal just reality that's going to be our world. Now that is important. And to feel that is important. To feel what it is, because that template is going to help us see everything that's there, but to see life now like a tent. To see your life, your physical body in that framework is helpful. So our bodies are like a tent. But now we get to gaze forward. Because as he compares this idea to a tent, he wants to draw us to our eternal dwelling, this thing that he likens to an eternal home. Well, let's go back to verse 1 of chapter 5, and we'll read the whole verse this time. It says, for we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house, not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So you kind of get the analogy, right? We're comparing a tent to a house, a tent that is a temporary, falling apart, wearing out thing, to now this thing that he says is our heavenly bodies, our heavenly future that is in the midst of this, our heavenly reality that is there. Now, as he draws our attention to that, he just gives us some qualities that will help us understand what that is. A couple of them are there in that verse 1. He says, this building, it's from God. It's God-made. That God's the one that's going to design it. We have a building that is from God. Remember what Jesus said? Pastor Phil prayed it this morning. When he looked at his disciples, he says, I'm going to go away. But when I go away, I'm going to prepare a place for you. That where I am, there you will be with me always. And I'll come and bring you back to that. There's an eternal dwelling. And that includes not just location, but our eternal bodies that he's going to give us. And he lets us know that those, unlike our physical bodies now that are temporary, those will be eternal. Those are ones that are going to last forever. Wow. Okay, that's just wild. More on that in a moment, but let's just keep reading. In verses 2 through 5, he begins to describe for us, 2 through 4, he begins to describe for us this reality. I'm going to read through it, but we're really going to focus on the end of it in verse 4. He says, for in this we groan, verse 2, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed. Hey, we'll come back and make more sense of that in a moment. In case you're like, what did that just say? Hey, we'll come back and explain that in a moment, but now catch this last phrase in verse 4. That mortality may be swallowed up by life. Wow, that's a really good description. It says this mortality, it's going to be just, life is going to be the reality. It's going to be swallowed up by life. It's going to be this incredible reality that draws us to everything. Wow. Now, just to give us enough hope, he adds to it in verse 5, now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God. Like he is wanting you to have this. He's prepared you for this if you're a follower of God. And he says he has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. If you're a child of God, if you know Jesus, one of the reality that happens is that the Spirit of God comes to live inside of us. So much so Paul would say in Romans 8, if you don't have the Spirit, you're not his. But if you have the Spirit of God living inside of you, it's not only that which is sustaining us and holding us and guiding us and helping us, it's a guarantee of what's to come. It's a down payment on the reality that God is going to bring to incredible fruition in eternity. Now that just raises up so many questions. I don't know if they raise up questions for you. It does raise up questions for me, and I'm grateful that God actually addresses this. Well, this time we want to just leave this here. We'll come back in a moment to it, but now just turn left. So you're in 2 Corinthians. Do go to 1 Corinthians 15, which is probably just a couple pages to your left. Make your way over to 1 Corinthians 15 because that's actually the question that he seeks to address there. In fact, I notice how he says it this way. 1 Corinthians 15, he says in verse 35, but someone will say, how are the dead raised up? With what body do they come? I'm so glad when God does that. He's like, someone's going to ask the question. I mean, because that's what he's been talking about in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the resurrection. He's talking about how that because Jesus has been resurrected, we're going to be resurrected. And he talks about a little bit of when and some incredible realities. But then he says, I know what somebody's thinking. Somebody's going to be asking the question. So like, well, what does that look like? Now I'm just because I'm just going to say, I'm asking the question. Like, I want it. Like, really? So we're going to get new bodies. I mean, we're going to get this resurrection. What do those bodies look like? Well, I'm so glad that question is asked and answered here. He gives it to us this way in verse 36. Foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. What you sow, you do not sow the body that shall be, but mere grain, perhaps wheat or some other grain. Okay, pause and think it through because he's describing for you and I new bodies, what this is going to be like, and he likens it to this idea of planting, like planting wheat or grain or a tree or fruit or flowers, however it works. And some of you are gardeners or you do this and so you understand. If you plant a tree or you plant, fruit, what you sow is not what's coming. You take a little seed that actually looks nothing like what's coming, right? So you could take like an acorn and you look there and think, okay, this is this acorn, and so I'm going to plant it. And when it plants, it's going to die. It's going to just dissolve. It's going to go away. But when it comes forth, it's going to be a glorious tree. And you wouldn't look at it and go, it looks just like the acorn. Totally saw that coming. No, it's entirely different and so much better. You would look at a seed and say, well, that's okay. That's kind of there. But what's coming is going to transform. It's going to be gloriously better and entirely different. Well, that's just helpful because here's the thing. That's not the way all of us think. Some of us think, hey, well, am I going to look the same way I look now? I mean, like when I die, at the age I die, is that what I'm stuck like forever? Or maybe do we all get like our 30-year-old body back? Like as good as it, is that what I'm going to look like? Am I going to look like what I am? And he says, no, you're not. No, you're not. What you have right now, it's like a seed, and it's going to go, and you're going to get a new body that is gloriously better, that is more beautiful, more full, and it's a brand new body. It's not just a recomposed or refixed or patched up. It's going to be new, so that's going to be exciting. We have this brand new body that's coming. Well, with that, he adds a couple other things that help us understand what it looks like. Verse 38, again, he tells it to us this way. He says, as you think about it, he says, but God gives a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. So each person has their own body, or saying it in a simple way, you're going to have your individual body. There's no kind of like losing yourself. You're not going to be involved in some kind of heavenly collective. There's no like Star Trek kind of thing where you become like the Borg and lose all your personality kind of thing. That's not heaven. Heaven is you're going to get a new body, and you're going to be you. You're going to be an individual with your own body and being able to interact both with God and with others. And I just want to tell you that is better than anything you've ever imagined. We don't have time to dive into it, but sometimes people ask those questions. And I know I do. It's like, will we know each other in heaven? Will we still be able to have relationships in heaven? And I just want to tell you, all that God designed that is good is going to be better there. I don't think relationships are going to be less. I think they're going to be better. And I think we are. We're going to know each other. There's a sense of this individual place that is going to be a part of that, and there's this individual reality that's going to be a part of our lives, and so we have, each of us, this brand new body that's coming. We'll keep going. He tells us in verse 39, all flesh is not the same flesh. There's one kind of flesh of men, and there's another kind of flesh of animals, and another of fish, and another of birds. He says, you see this. The birds aren't like fish, and fish aren't like men. We all have different bodies. There are also celestial or heavenly. There are also celestial bodies, verse 40, and terrestrial or earthly bodies. But the glory of the celestial is one, and of the terrestrial is another. So we're going to have bodies that are distinctively different. They're not earthly, they're heavenly bodies, which all by itself is a huge reality, just describing something that is far beyond anything that we've begun to understand, that which can be a part of all that heaven is. Let's just keep reading. He tells us in verse 42, so also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. We're going to get bodies that are incorruptible. This is really good. In fact, we just want to take a quick moment to think about it for a second. Right now, your body is corruptible. That is, you're wearing down and you break. You're wearing down, and you are someone who can and does easily break, and pain's a part of it, but we're looking to a body that can never wear down and never break. There's no more pain. There's no more sorrow. There's no more suffering. Those realities are no longer a part of our being. We now have that which will never enter into that kind of reality again. That's exciting. I just want to tell you that's exciting. In fact, again, I just want to quickly lay out to you, that's going to just open up realms of possibility. See, sometimes people have this view of heaven like it's going to be boring. Like, we're all going to sit on a cloud with our little harp playing. That is entirely never a biblical picture. God says, I'm going to make a brand new heavens. I'm going to make a new earth. And I just want to tell you that all that we know in this world that is run down by sin, it's only going to be made better. And I personally believe we're going to be able to fully enjoy it. I believe we'll be able to enjoy all of God's creation. In fact, we'll be able to enjoy things that some of us can't enjoy now. I don't know about you. There's a lot of parts of creation that I would love to see. I mean, there are some places, maybe tops of mountains that are, huge and beautiful, or the bottoms of oceans, or maybe perhaps even out in the stars and, just being able to explore the galaxy. And here's our problem. We can't get there. Most of us, we can't get there because, well, it'll kill us. I mean, some of you know. It's like, man, I would love to do that whole deep sea diving thing, but that's just scary. It's just a scary thing. It's a dangerous thing, but what if it's no longer dangerous? What if there's no longer you could enjoy all of God's creation? Now, I recognize, hey, there's going to be somebody that's like, man, that would take the fun away from it. Isn't it kind of like, just pushing the envelope on? Tell you, hey, that adrenaline, that's its own thing, that, some of it maybe will have a good part of that, but sometimes it robs you from the experience itself because you enjoy the adrenaline, not the place. And I want to tell you, we're going to enjoy the place. And I think there's going to be a glorious place where you could say, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of pain, sorrow, suffering, or being broken. And we're going to have bodies that are going to be incorruptible. They'll never be able to kind of enter into that reality again. On top of that, he goes on to say it this way in verse 43, it is sown in dishonor, and it's raised in glory. Right now, your body is hindered because of sin, and sin marks who you are. It's a problem. It's what both brings sickness and disease, but it's more than that. It's as if it marks all that we are. What's going to make this so glorious that it'll never be again who you are? Sin will never be a part of that whole thing, and it will never have anything that robs it of the glory that's coming. It's going to be sown in glory. It's going to be raised in glory. Verse 43 again, in the middle of it, it is sown in weakness, and it's raised in power. So right now, again, just saying it in a different way, part of your problem is your body is weak. Both again by just because of our sickness, because of our hindrances, there are things that hold us back and hold us down. Can I say it in a different way? Hey, Christian, you're due for an upgrade. A really good upgrade. You're going to get power. You're going to have a life that is touched by power that will enable you to be and live in the fullest of all that God has for you, where weakness holds you down and back. Now, it'll never be again. We have this incredible reality. Wow. Well, then he just kind of seals it up with one more description. He says it this way in verse 44, it is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. There's a natural body. There is also a spiritual body. So let's just be honest. That doesn't answer every question. There's so much we still try to figure out, like, what does that actually look like? You're telling me somewhat it's not, which is helpful, but I just want to tell you it's going to be better than anything we've ever seen. And so he's kind of laying out to us, hey, this is what your expectation should be. This place where you're going to get a new body that's a heavenly body, incorruptible, glorious, powerful, spiritual. This is what is coming. I think about it in Revelation 21, where some of you will read more on Tuesday, God giving us the chance. He says, I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. And they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. Hey, just quick FYI, kind of interesting little part of it. I told you that I believe that Revelation 21 and 22 really is a picture of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Tabernacles pictures those realities. And there's just a little kind of a fun tie-in because he uses those two terms right in the middle of it. He says, right now, the tabernacle of God, that which was a tent, which was temporary, that was what the people had with God, now he's going to dwell. Now we're going to have this eternal dwelling with him, and hands down, that's going to be the best part of the whole thing. The best part of our heavenly home is going to be God's presence. That no longer will it be a temporary thing. No longer will we have these moments where it's like I had a good day, now I have a bad day. I feel close to God, and now I'm far away from God. It's like we will be in his presence always and forever. And it will be the greatest part of our joy. And again, I like that. I believe in one sense he's kind of giving us that foreshadow in this verse that now we're going to have this eternal dwelling. Then he goes on in verse 4 and says, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain. For the former things have passed away. What incredible news, saying it to us in a different way. He says, okay, here's the deal. People will never die again. Death will never be the fear. It'll never be the reality. There's never going to be something that crushes you. There's no more emotional sorrow. There's no sorrow. There's no crying. And there's never, ever going to be pain again. Wow. I don't even know what to say about that. I just want to tell you that's nothing like what you live in right now. Pain is something that we go through. Some of you face it every single day. Some of you live a life whereby pain is your experience, and he's telling you, hey, that's not going to be the reality. In that time, there's no more pain. There's no more part of that. There's nothing else that's there. So when we're thinking about this analogy that the Feast of Tabernacles is about, is he's telling us about our heavenly bodies, our heavenly home that God is making. It's eternal. It's going to be, life that swallows up mortality, that is incredible hope. So I think you probably get it, but let's put it together. So we have this thing where we're looking at our bodies now as tents. We're looking at our heavenly bodies as a home. And so the whole point of the Feast of Tabernacles is inviting you to anticipate a reality whereby this life is only in hindsight. I think you get it, right? Let me just try. So here's the point. The children of Israel, they traveled, they lived in tents, and then eventually they got into they got into a home, a permanent dwelling. And he says, I just want you in those places to look back and remember what it was like when you didn't have this, when you were in all of those spaces. So when we think about the Feast of Tabernacles, we're anticipating a day that I personally believe will really happen. I believe that you and I, if you're a follower of Jesus, that we're going to be in heaven, and maybe every year we'll set aside have a Feast of Tabernacles, and we'll get together and we'll remember. And in fact, I just want to give you an invitation. I just invite you to do it with me. So we'll get together maybe on the shore of some heavenly, river that's flowing out of the temple of God, and we'll eat some of those incredible fruits that Revelation 21 and 22 talk about, and then we'll just sit down there and we'll talk. So when you remember living on earth before Jesus gave us these brand new bodies, what do you remember? I mean, what is it you look back to living in your physical body that was like a tent? What was that like? And again, the point of it is it's joy. I mean, he says, I want you to rejoice. I want you just to rejoice in what you now get. And so we'll have this conversation. I don't know what it is we'll talk about, but I'm pretty sure somewhere along the idea, one of us is going to go, do you remember COVID? You remember the masks? And we'll be like, I'm so glad we never have to do that again. We'll be like, yes. And then somebody's going, no, COVID was real. No, I remember cancer. I remember the fears of it. I remember going through it. And we'll go, yeah, I'm so glad that's never a reality again. Some of you are facing pain. Again, I think about people who deal with arthritis, or you deal with fibromyalgia, and you deal with things, and you deal with it every day. And I just want to tell you, we're going to be there on that day, and you're going to be like, no, I remember that. And I'm so glad it's never my experience, because it's all in hindsight now. It's never a present reality. Now, I'm just going to remember, how good it is where I am now, because I remember what I went through. So that's the point. The point of the Feast of Tabernacles is a place where we are meant to say, hey, there's going to be a time when we look back at all of this is. And we'll talk about different things. We'll talk about cancer and pain. And we might even go like, you remember allergies? That was crazy. Like you wake up and your eyes were all puffy and like, oh yeah, I remember that. And you remember waking up and you got out of bed and your back hurt, and you're like, oh, I remember that. I don't do that any longer. I almost forgot how good this is, that we live in something that is so never pain, never sorrow, never ever again. So the point of that is that's what it's in causing us to anticipate. That he's telling us there's going to be a day that's where we are. Again, going back to that passage in Revelation, he says, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said, right, for these words are true and faithful. He says, I'm going to make it all new. It's going to be brand new. It's going to be glorious. And this is the truth. This is faithful. This is really coming. This is really coming for us. This is really a part of our existence. This is the reality. In fact, if you read that in Revelation 21 and 22, you get to the end of it in chapter 22, where it says, he who testifies to these things coming quickly, which is Jesus, by the way. He looks at everything he's just told us. He says, guys, I'm coming. And I'm going to come pretty fast. It's going to be before you know it. And our response to it is, even so come. Yes. Yes. You know, like we are so in, like we're looking forward to what's coming. And so he's inviting us to that. So the point of the Feast of Tabernacles is that's going to be a day where we are. But let's just own it for a second. We're not there. I mean, that's the point. You still live in a tent. You still live in a physical body that is yet anticipating that, which is what he says next. He invites us here in 2 Corinthians to say, hey, that's how we're living, but we see it that way. Go back and see how he describes it if you're still there. In 1 Corinthians, by the way, turn over to 2 Corinthians again. There in verse 5, he says it this way. In verse 6, so we are always confident, knowing that while we're at home in the body, we're absent from the Lord. Like right now, we live in this body, but we're not yet living where that's going to be. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. He says, here's how you and I are being invited to live, into a place where we're not setting our eyes on this world, on the temporary things. We're doing what it says in Colossians. We're setting our mind on things above, not on things here beneath. That we're saying, hey, I live by faith. I live by what is not yet present. I live and say that's more important than these present things because of everything that's there. I live in a way of just believing that that's exactly what he has for me. In fact, I like the way he described it in the verses that we kind of skipped a little bit earlier. Go back to verse 2. It says, for in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. I just like it. I mean, I don't know how to, I love the way Paul says, like, that's just true. He says, in this we groan. Sometimes I like to think about it. Like every time we actually groan, we're actually groaning for heaven. Like every time you're like, it's like, you didn't know it, but your body was like, I can't wait till I don't do that any longer. I mean, every time, and I groan for it, but it's more than that. I yearn, I desire, I long for that day. He goes on to simply say, if indeed having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Saying it simply, if our mindset is right about this, it's not that we're just looking forward to dying. You know, we're not just looking forward to being unclothed or getting rid of this tent or getting rid of all those things. That surely should not be the fullness of our anticipation. It's like we want to be clothed. I want my new body. I want heaven. I want to be in his presence. I mean, it's not just that I'm looking forward to this no longer being hard. I'm looking forward to what's on the other side of that. I live by faith in what is coming. I live in a sense that gives me that joy, that he invites you and I to it. I think about how Paul would say it in Philippians. He says, for our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Great way to say it. If you're a Christian, you really belong in heaven. It's not your home. And we're eagerly waiting for Jesus to come back and take us home, who, when he comes, will transform our lowly body that it may be conformed to his glorious body, according to the working by which he is able to subdue all things to himself, which is just a mouthful, but it's just a good thing. It's like he can do it. Like he's going to come back and we're going to be changed. We're going to get brand new bodies. They're going to be gloriously changed into what he has for us, and that's what I'm living for. One of my favorite descriptions of that is found in the book of Hebrews in the Hall of Faith, and talks about those who lived by faith and spoke specifically of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It says he, by faith he, speaking of Abraham, dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So Abraham, he says, Abraham lived his entire life never actually having a home. The only property that he ever bought was actually a burial plot for Sarah and eventually him. So he lives his entire life living as a pilgrim, as one is passing through. And he says, hey, that's how he lived his life. These, speaking of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all lived in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them. Afar off were assured of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. He says there's one sense that they could see it. They could see that there was something better coming, that there was a better city, a better place to dwell. And so they said, you know what, this is not my home. They confessed it. We don't really belong here. I'm a stranger. I'm a pilgrim. I don't belong in this world. For those who say such things, it goes on to say, declare plainly that they seek a homeland. It's one of my favorite verses in there. I don't actually know entirely why. I just like it. And I just do it not infrequently. Sometimes I'll just quote that verse and I'll just say, God, I just wanted to say it plainly. I want a homeland. I want heaven. This world is not my home. I don't fit down here. I don't belong down here. I'm a pilgrim. I'm a stranger. This is not my eternal. I long for heaven. And I like what it says. It says, if you do that, it's as if you're just saying it clearly. You're just saying it plainly. It says, truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they'd come out, they would have had opportunity to return. If it was this world that was your joy, then you could have pursued that. If it was living in Hawaii or living on top of a mountain, you could have made that your pursuit. But it says they didn't. None of those things were actually what they were looking for. They were desiring, it says. Now they desire a better. That is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. New bodies, a city that Revelation is going to talk about. If you guys read it this week, he says, here's the thing. God is like, I love to give you that. I want to give you that. If that's where you are. And so he's calling us to have that kind of embrace, that you and I live our lives, that we would say, hey, I live my life living for what I cannot yet see. I walk by faith, not by sight. And that's the reality and the way that you and I are meant to do now. One more quick nugget on that. It would also give you help in it. Go back to the beginning of the section. Go back to chapter 4, verse 16, and notice how it begins. He says, therefore, we do not lose heart. So he prefaced this whole section and says, life is hard. Life can be difficult, but we don't lose heart. Why? Because he goes on to say, our light affliction, it's working out something so much more glorious. That's our perspective. In other words, this expectation of heaven, this expectation of our new bodies, this expectation of everything that's there, it's one of the things that helps us make it through this life. Does it for you? I don't know if it does. I'm just going to tell you it does for me. And I actually need this. I mean, it's one of those places that sometimes this world can get wearing. I mean, it can be one of those places where you find yourself recognizing it's difficult, it's hard, and it's hard in the midst of it. And there's a place of saying, how do we do that? How do we make it through this space? Because we recognize what's coming. We fix our eyes on what is to come. We walk by faith, not by sight. Today, I just want to call you to live such a life that in light of everything that's there, that you would be one that would anticipate it and live in light of it. So one last nugget, and we'll close there. So all of this is a part of this. We think about this great reality. I quoted to you a moment ago there in Revelation 21, where God says, then he who sat on the throne says, behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, write, for these words are true and faithful. It's coming. God is going to make everything new. That's good news. And if you know Jesus, that is your solid expectation. Whether you believe it or not, it's coming. But what I love here is that when God explains this, he immediately reaches out to those of you who that is not your destination right now. He goes on to simply says, and he said to me, it is done. I'm the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. If you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus, I need to tell you as clearly as I can. This is not your future. This is not your future. Heaven is not your future home. Hell is. And right now, that reality should both scare you, but also hear God's heart. He says, I'll give it to you. I'll give you the water of life if you want it. If you would look at it and say, hey, this world doesn't satisfy. These things aren't real. I want that which is eternal. He says, if you're thirsty, to anybody who thirsts, come to me. Jesus would say, and I'll give you life. If you would come to that, and God just reaches out and says, if you would believe upon him, to him who overcomes, you'll inherit all things. I will be his God, and he shall be my son. Like if you'll gain all of this, and you gain me, and it would be the best part of the whole deal. So I invite you to that. If you don't know Jesus, then today's the day for you to surrender. But hear me as clear as I can. If you refuse, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death, or we know commonly as hell. That lake of fire that burns forever and ever, says that will be your destination. If fear holds you back, if cowardness keeps you from believing in Jesus and you don't believe and instead look for your life in sin, that's where the world is going to go for you. But Jesus would rescue you from it. He would rescue, that's what we're here for right now. And so I'm telling you, if in the midst of this you want yourself to say, well, I want the things that you've talked about this morning, Pastor Jim. I'd like to have a new body and a heavenly home and no more sin and no more pain. Then he just says, hey, if you want it, I'll give it. But you got to come to Jesus. Jesus is the only way, truth, and the life. And desperately this morning, that is what you need. So here's what we want to do. We want to just give you a moment to pray about that. Maybe, again, it's you and that you're that person I just described. We're going to take a quiet moment and pray, and we're just going to invite you in that quiet moment to ask for what God is telling you he'd give you. He says, anybody, if you want it, if you're thirsty, I would give you eternal life. So if that's you in that quiet moment of prayer, please talk to him and then come up and talk to us afterwards. We'd love to be a part of it. But for the rest of you, if you know Jesus here this morning, I just want to tell you, you're being called to live in light of it. Maybe you do. Maybe I've said something so simple this morning, you're like, yeah, Jim, I couldn't make it through without that reality. But sometimes we forget it, and sometimes we lose heart, and maybe this morning you just needed to recognize it again. In fact, maybe it's just your opportunity to do what it said there in Hebrews. It says, those who say such things declare plainly that they're longing for it. Maybe today is a day for you just to do that. Between you and the Lord, that you would just sit there and say, God, I just wanted to say it right now. This world's not my home. I don't want it. I don't fit here. I don't belong here. I'm a pilgrim. I'm a stranger, and I'm looking for a heavenly inheritance. I'm looking for a heavenly home. And just set yourself in a place, and God says that He's not ashamed of those, and to those who long, He's going to give that and so much more. So it's a great place for us just to live in light of that and allow that hope just to wash over us, with a joyful expectation of what is to come, which is so incredibly good. So you take a quiet moment. I'll do the same. Let's just pray, whatever that is, wherever he's met you in this moment. You talk to him about that, and then we'll come back and close together and worship in just a moment. Father, today, right now, just in light of the Feast of Tabernacles taking place on Tuesday, I just am so looking forward to what's coming. But I do pray for any that are here that don't know you, that don't have the hope that I have. And I pray that you would rescue them from a certain destruction and horrible end. Rescue them from hell. Draw them to the hope of heaven. But then, Lord, I pray for those of us who know you, And I think about it in some ways, these are not concepts that are not constantly held out to us in your word, but sometimes we just need to hear them again. That you'd wash over us with hope and anticipation of the joy of that day when the problems and pains, limitations, and sorrows and sufferings of this world will be no more. God, with an expectation of eternity, of heaven, where no more pain, sorrow, or suffering. Lord, we today want to live in light of that. We want to walk by faith, not by sight, not living our lives only seeing the things of this world. God, would you help us now? Would you help us right here to believe? So as for me, I just want to say it plainly. That's my hope, my expectation, and my joy. Lord, this world is not my home. I'm looking forward to heaven. I set my affections, my hope, on a city whose builder and maker is God. And I'm so longing for that. Thank you for that. Thank you for the hope that's there, the joy that's there. Meet us in that, and just thank you for your faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. May God just take that and make it just as real to you and as personal to you, in a space of just drawing you to all that is. If you have questions, talk to us. We'd love to be a part of it. Again, if you're surrendering your life to Jesus, we'd love to be a part of it. But right now, we just want to close in worship. We want to enter into a space where we just end that way. So why don't you stand? We're just going to make God our focus as we celebrate, what is to come and that glorious day. I just want to bless you in his name. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.